I found a hanger. So this tutorial has been requested for a lot of time, but no one has voted yet. But now its time has come. We're gonna do some psychology. Yeah, that's what I meant. I have dyslexia! As well as some math. But don't worry, it's gonna be simple, so I'm sure everyone's gonna be able to follow. Buckle up for the frame-by-frame tutorial on Mine Imator. We're gonna do it the right way. So before I begin, I want to ask you to show support by dropping a like and hitting the bell for more content. With that on the side, let's begin with this project here. So there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to frame-by-frame animation. You see these numbers on the timeline down here? They are not frames, they are ticks. They don't act like frames, they act like ticks. Ticks are not frames, okay? It's a misconception. My tempo is set to 24, which means 24 ticks make up 1 second. So in between those 24 ticks, 1 second passes. We can also count. That's 1 second. If you were to make a keyframe of each one of those 24 ticks, that's not gonna serve as 1 frame on your animation. That doesn't help you if you export the animation with 60 frames per second. Because what that means is that it's gonna create 60 frames in between those 24 ticks. You only have 24 ticks, but 60 frames in your animation. I don't know why it says 24 frames if it's 24 ticks. Let me get your facts straight. This method would work if you would export at 24 frames per second, because then it would create 24 frames in this 1 second, meaning each tick would be 1 frame. This would be a good formula if you want to make a frame-by-frame animation. If you want to make a 60 frames per second animation, you would need to have your tempo be set to 60, because then this is 1 second, and in between this second, 60 frames will get created, which means each tick would be 1 frame. If you have your tempo set to 60 frames per second, but your tempo is set to 30, this is now 1 second, it's still gonna create 60 frames in between those 30 ticks. I gotta zoom in now. This is gonna be 1 frame, this half is going to be the other frame, this is going to be the next frame, this is going to be a frame, 60 frames for 30 ticks. This example best works if you just set the tempo to 1, because now it's very simple to explain. I zoomed out as close as possible. This is now 1 second. This 1 tick, 1 second passes. You see how slow it is? It's going to create 60 frames in this 1 second. What I think this tooltip should do is basically tell you how many frames it's going to create, because now my settings are on 60 FPS, and selecting 5 of these, 5 times 60, that's like 300 frames. 5 seconds per 60 FPS. So if you want 1 tick to be 1 frame in the animation, you have to match your tempo with the frames per second. But that's kind of a problem because Mine Imator only has 3 options, 24, 30, and 60, which is not very efficient. I personally think Mine Imator should have more, like 50 and 120, or entirely a custom variation. Let's say you make an animation with 120 frames per second. How is that gonna help you? Well, it is. Let's say you're making a slow motion scene, and the rest of the animation is 60 frames per second, but you export 120, so in the editing software, you can make one part twice as slower and still keep the 60 frames per second tempo. Now I gotta do it manually. Does anyone remember my 12 principles of animation video? It's an old video, but it gets the point across. In the 9th principle of timing, I talked about something about counting frames and stuff. Well, this is basically it. Now in 2D animation, that means also calculating how many frames you have to input in the video. Old Disney animators, when they were making frames by hand, they had to know, oh, the animation is gonna be 24 frames per second. So if I want my ball to stay up in the air for 0.8 seconds, how many frames do I need to draw? This is basically it, because this is gonna be 60 frames per second, but you only have 24 ticks to make the move. Alright, here's a better example. Let's say you set your tempo to 100, and you use up this slot entirely to make a really complex motion. Take note, this is still just 1 second, so this is gonna play out really fast. So yeah, let's make a really complex motion. Every frame is gonna move something. This is gonna be very detailed because there's a lot of small motion in between. How does that help you, man? If you're gonna export with 24 frames per second, there's only going to be 24 frames created. You have 100 keyframes, but only 24 of those are going to be visible. You know what I mean? So here I have a ball. I'll move this ball with 24 frames per second because my tempo is on 24. If you want to make a 60 frames per second animation, it's going to be very tedious because then you have to make 60 frames individually. So if you want to make frame by frame, I recommend you going for a low frame rate. I want to make this sphere move. You can cheat the system and just go for an ease in and out. But that's really not much of a frame-by-frame animation if you just apply the transition and this is not a frame-by-frame. So let's say I'm gonna create a keyframe each time in the timeline. I'm gonna keep the easy in transition. Let's see. So is that still the same transition you wanted? No, it's not. You messed it up by adding all those keyframes. Don't do that. So let's say I want to make an ease in and out. So the ease in and out is going to last 9 ticks, which is roughly a little less than half a second. So it's gonna go from this point to 26 here. This is gonna be an easy in and out transition from one state to the other. If you don't want a linear motion, you gotta use this little trick here. You have the first frame and the final frame, but in the middle frame, move it by half the amount. Here it says 26, so let's move it by 13 here. And in the middle of those two frames, move it by half that amount, so 6.5, and this should be 19.5, so it's like this. But now it's still just linear, so let's add an in-between frame between those two as well. So now we have this. If we put all the keyframes together now, of course I messed it up, but this is an ease in and out on an instant transition. This is very slow, you should add more of these. Now I have this, which doesn't look too bad in terms of frame-by-frame animation. Of course, you could just go for something like this. This was actually made by Pig and Movie. I just thought about it and I just put an example because I'm too lazy to make my own. But yeah, what's also interesting about frame-by-frame is you can have those in-between frames, the middle ones, be very exaggerated. If you're going for squash and stretch, you can have this ball be very squashed and very stretched, and it would just look like it's casually got squashed and stretched. But if you take a look at the middle frame in particular, this is way too much. But it's only going to be one frame, which means you can exaggerate the movements a lot better. This is the 10th principle of animation called exaggeration. I talked about this before as well. Again, old video, but it gets the point across. So this is it, a short tip on how to make your frame-by-frame animation the right way in Mine Imator, matching the ticks with the frames, as well as a short tip on how you can make the eased motion. One thing I didn't tell you though is how you can make an ease out only or ease in only, so I'm gonna tell you that before I end the video as well. So I want to make my ball move from this point to this point. And actually an even better method for what I talked about before is if you just kept the motion linear for this part and then just add this in-between frame here. So now this one is in the center, and now make another keyframe here, make another keyframe here, so you ease both ends, and then you just proceed to make multiple keyframes for those parts, and then just blend them together. You did what I did before. Because by keeping it linear, you can just make a point in the center of the motion and it's going to have the half of the previous two motions. I know it's hard to understand without visual material, so I'll link a video from Alan Becker who explains it better than I just did here. But if you want to do it ease in only or ease out only, you basically have the motion for only one end of the spectrum. Remember to keep your motion eased though, because linear is never okay. So that was it, a short explanation of how to make it frame-by-frame animation in Mine Imator the right way, as well as some tips on how to do it. Thank you for watching and good luck with the subject. Now stay sharp.